2. Servalan looked up from her high-backed chair. The office was simple, stark, monotone. The screen and the touch-sensitive plate next to the vidphone were the only items on the desk. Her hair, as ever, was short and jet black. Her clothes, on the other hand, were elaborate but still not colourful. The dress reached the floor. The long sleeves nearly covered her hands. Her shoes were totally impractical for movement, yet somehow she managed without any sign of difficulty or discomfort. She looked up at her guest and smiled, a sweet smile revealing, to those who knew her, more malice than friendship. "You were on the planet, Captain Telon?" she asked carefully. The officer of the crack Federation surveillance squad, LD-9, stood squarely to attention. "Yes, Commissioner." His helmet and face mask were held correctly in his right hand, his left arm straight to his side. His feet were a regulation 12 inches apart. His black uniform had one flash of colour, the Federation globe positioned just over his heart. "What were your orders there?" "To remove the prisoners held in the compound and return them to Earth." "To Earth?" Servalan moved her mouth to produce a slightly quizzical look. Her head tilted to one side. The smile changed slightly and became momentarily more encouraging. "They must have captured someone important for those degenerates in the administration to stir themselves." "Commissioner!" The captain hesitated, unsure of his superior officer's security clearance. This could be a test of his efficiency. He allowed himself a swift intake of breath and then decided to push on. "For some time, the planet had been used by the enemies of our Federation. We have had them under close surveillance and had infiltrated their command structure. Our enemies were planning rebellion and were trying to attract other dissident elements to their base. All of the rebels were to be rounded up." "Rebels," Servalan sneered at the word. She placed her hands firmly on her desk and stood up, brushing past the captain as she swept across her office. "Who were these great outlaws that senior officers of the Federation had to rush halfway across the galaxy in order to have them arrested?" "One was the rebel leader Blake, Commissioner." The sneer froze on Servalan's face. For a moment she did not speak, she did not move. She barely breathed as she turned to the captain. "Did you say Blake?" "Yes, Commissioner. I supervised the identification of his body. He was dead, shot repeatedly from very close range." "You are sure it was Blake?" "Yes, Commissioner. He is one of the main criminals wanted by our Federation. We have his picture." "Don't tell me about Blake, you fool!" Servalan snapped. "I know more about him than you'll ever know." "What about the others?" "We found a number of bodies and signs that other people had been injured and had left the area. We were about to start roundup and identification, according to orders, when we were attacked." "By whom?" "Madam, we have no idea. The attack was sudden and came from outside the compound. We evacuated the dome to avoid being caught by Aeolene 97. It is a standard precaution. The new gas can maim instantly. By retreating through the compound, we were able to avoid the attackers and leave without loss beyond those involved in the shooting of Blake, of whom 4 were seriously injured." Servalan stopped her pacing and turned to the captain. Correctly, he had remained facing the commissioner's desk, even though she were no longer seated there. "You mean you evacuated without even seeing your opponents?" "Yes, Commissioner. Our instrumentation clearly showed overwhelming forces attacking us, and because our prime orders were to ensure the final elimination of Blake, it was felt we had complied with—" "And Blake?" "Madame?" The question seemed incomprehensible. Had Servalan not been listening? "Blake, you fool, Blake! Where is the body of Blake?" "I presume still on the planet, Commissioner. As I reported, Madame, we evacuated rapidly. There was no time to return to the domes." "So there is no proof Just your word. Madam, you may go, Telon. Servalan's voice was suddenly harsh. There was no room for argument. The officer left. Servalan continued to pace the room, her fists clenched. Her strides were as long as her full dress would permit. The material made a gentle swishing as it ruffled against the synthetic floor coverings. She had wanted Blake for her own. The rumours of his continued existence had circulated ever since the Galactic War. She knew. She had even cultivated them at times. But a rumour of his death, that would never serve her purpose. Servalan returned to the console at her desk. Yes, Commissioner? It was the voice of a mutoid, the only being Servalan ever really trusted. Vampire-like, they existed on blood plasma, but were moderately good fighters and totally reliant. Bring me a complete analysis of the status of the planet Gouda Prime. There was no more conversation. The mutoid, trained to accept the personality of her commander, had long since learned not to waste time with formalities. Instead, she instantly called up the information from Data Central and transferred it into a small plastic-like card. The mutoid, to anyone not knowing how she lived could have been an attractive young female, took the card to Servalan and immediately left the room. Servalan studied the information carefully. She read of the frontier planet's transformation from a peaceful agricultural society into an open planet, where the normal laws of the Federation were abandoned in order to increase the speed at which natural resources were being exploited. She read the classified appended report that the planet was apparently suspected of being used by criminal elements as a gathering place, and that political motives were suspected. She read of the bounty hunters, whose job involved rounding up and killing the criminals who had enjoyed freedom under the now terminated open planet policy. She read of the existence of an infiltrated Federation unit ready to take out the rebels. And she read no more. That was all. No Blake, no mention of Avon or Aurak, no mention of their spaceship Scorpio with its teleport facilities, probably the only teleport system left in the galaxy. A puzzled look passed over Servalan's face. She stared at the blank screen in front of her. Finally, she used the vidphone. A second later, a picture appeared. The dismissed captain back in his quarters looked somewhat more nervous than he had in Servalan's presence. But irrespective of his feelings, he naturally obeyed the Commissioner's command to return. "Captain," said Servalan, as soon as the door closed behind him, "you must forgive my abruptness of a moment ago, forged entirely by disappointment. The man, Blake, you may have heard of him," the captain nodded, "an arch-criminal, and the thought of him dead and not answering my questions momentarily flooded my judgment. A weakness on my part. Forgive me." The captain was suitably stunned. Not only was it unheard of from a senior Federation commissioner to ask a captain to accept an apology, for Servalan to do so was beyond belief. He made a sound deep in his throat which could have been a cough, a protestation, or an acknowledgement. Servalan seemed to find it acceptable. "I have been looking at the data on the planet." She affected not to remember its name. "Gouda Prime," the captain helped her out. "Of course, Gouda Prime." She waved a delicate hand imperiously. "And I can see the problems you faced." She paused. The captain looked relieved. "But I also think there is more information than can be found from the planet. I therefore propose an expedition to return there, with you in charge." Telon was impressed and felt duty-bound to protest his lack of qualifications for the job. The protestations confirmed Servalan's view of the man. She pressed on with the plan rapidly forming in her brain. "It will be a highly secret mission, Captain, for if there are forces lurking in that part of the frontier, they will certainly pounce on a large fleet, and our chances of finding what evidence remains will be lost. We will take just one ship, mine. You will command. If you will make ready." The captain was dismissed before further speeches could be made. Servalan sat back in her chair and smiled. From the cabinet below her monitor, she took a tumbler full of intoxicating green liquid and sipped gently. The smile on her lips grew. Avon did not smile. Corell was giving him far too much freedom to plot and plan. As part of his mind worked on that problem, the rest of him concentrated on other matters. There was no difficulty getting time alone with Villa. Corell regularly wandered around the plantation base, looking for the items that Aurak specified would be needed to build the fusion drive amendments they needed. But Villa reported that his search had drawn a blank. He had worked his way through every section of the ship, and there was nothing that looked remotely like a computer apart from those bits which should be there. The onboard mainframe also looked normal. Once Villa had opened it up, Avon inspected it, but could find no sign of tampering. Avon sat down behind the bank of instruments that made up the main control board which faced the captain's position. He needed more information, and he needed it quickly if he were not to be forced into trusting Corell with more than he wanted to give away. The Aurak computer was still giving out that subtle distress code he had found on switching the machine back on, and as long as that happened, there was a strong chance that this outside force, whatever it was up to something not entirely to Avon's benefit. But unless he had some other information soon, he was going to have to ask Aurak for help, and the danger of that was that if machine-induced neural deviance was at work, it could use Aurak as a booster to increase its influence. In desperation, Avon turned to Villa. The thief had his feet up on the pilot's desk and was trying to flick small pellets of carbon into a waste discharge point on the far side of the control cabin. "After the shootout, tell me again, what happened after you crawled away from the action?" "You mean, what happened after you shot Blake?" Villa was not going to let Avon forget that. Ever. He was still completely unsure why Blake had been shot. But, whatever the reason, it didn't matter. Villa owed much to Blake. Blake had rescued him from the prison planet Cygnus Alpha, before a clever vidcast commentator had thought of calling them Blake 7. Villa had heard that the commentator had then found himself transferred to Cygnus Alpha, theoretically to make a documentary on the subject of the criminals deported there. Unlike Blake, he had never made it back. Blake had gone to Cygnus Alpha to rescue Villa. Blake had been the nearest thing Villa had ever had to a father figure, at least in Villa's memory. And Avon had shot him. Avon offered no comment. Villa shrugged. "After I got out, I looked for somewhere to shelter. I went into the nearest ship, this one, switched the rear viewers on and watched." "Did you see any guards outside?" "Only bodies." Avon found it hard to believe. "Were they all dead?" "I didn't ask them, but their conversation wasn't up to much." "What about Tarrant, Dana, Sulin?" "What about Blake?" Despite the taunt, Avon was determined to pursue his line of questioning. "Didn't you see anyone alive or hear anything?" "Hear anything? It was commando country out there. All the bounty hunters, hundreds of them on the communication channels, spread out across the planet, armed to the teeth, shouting orders at each other." "Then what? Did you see them?" "No. After a while they just stopped shouting. It all went silent." "Equipment failure?" "No, I checked. Avon, I know you think I am stupid." "You've noticed." "But I wanted to know what was going on. I checked and double-checked. There was nothing else to do." Avon thought again. It made little sense. In the distance, the night animals were beginning to make themselves heard as sunlight faded. He could see Corell walking back to the ship carrying several crates, followed by 2 androids equally loaded down. Avon looked at Aurak solemnly. He really did need some information. "Nothing arrived. No ships apart from your mysterious sphere." "Nothing. Just one freighter takeoff, plus the flyers on the far side of the dome. After that, it all went quiet. The work progressed rapidly. The androids raided the other ships for the items Arak specified, and followed the master computer's instructions for putting the whole thing together. Avon took control of the delicate control disk work and general reprogramming of the solid-state circuitry and tarial cell link-ups. Villa opened doors and lockers, sometimes overtly because Carell requested it, sometimes covertly because Avon was still seeking the interfering device, and sometimes in the vague hope that he might find something interesting. Carell continued to run her slack regime. After a week of the preparations, Avon could have taken off in what was, by then, a fairly fast ship with Arak to guide the navigation computers, and, if he really wanted him, Villa as a galley hand. But he didn't leave, and Carell seemed secure in the knowledge that he wouldn't. Avon concentrated his mind in a way he had not had to do for some time. For years it seemed his brain had been going rusty. True, once or twice he had had to outwit some clever opponents, people who replied not just on force, but on brain skill. But mostly, he had faced crude fighters like Servalan. It seemed so long ago that he had had to solve a real problem that was not of his own making. He put his mind into a rigorous routine. After 2 weeks, Avon finally made his move. The approach was elegant and yet simple. Carell, as a social technologist, worked on a set of assumptions as to what Avon would do and took countermeasures accordingly. So Avon instructed Arak to generate long lists of human activities which were possible on Gouda Prime. Avon then numbered them and instructed the ship's computer to generate random number series. As soon as a number was generated which matched one of Arak's activities, he undertook that action. He went for a walk in the forest in the pouring rain. He held a long and pointless conversation with Villa on the subject of theft. He asked Arak for guidance on the question of certain obscure mathematical formula long since abandoned in computer logic. He started doing physical exercises, but gave them up when he realized he needed them. He built a weather forecasting unit. He measured the daily growth of 50 randomly selected trees. And on the 5th day, he carried Villa's kit for him when he went to open a series of doors at Carell's bidding. "Of course," Villa announced. "I respect a person who sees my value. Carell, she has a job. She sees a man who can do it, and off we go. She gets the job well done, and I—" "That way," Avon interrupted. Villa was too deep into his self-congratulation to notice he was lost. "The directions send you down corridor 24 to the intersection F4. That," Avon told him, with a wave of the hand, "is corridor 24. Villa accepted the course correction with a grunt and a nod, and returned to his monologue. "Blake knew my value too. I always got on with Blake. 'Blake,' I used to say, 'give me a door to open and I'll do it. Don't worry about the danger. If I can be of help, then just let me know.'" As he rambled on, his voice changed subtly. It became more lilting. He spoke with a flowing ease that totally left him when faced with reality. It was that, and his inability to deal with people in real life, that had sent Villa into a life of crime. Villa loved mankind, and desperately wanted to be able to cope with it. Avon could cope only too easily, and because of that, despised everyone he met. Avon pulled himself away from his own thoughts and found Villa still rambling. "Dana, she knew it too. Always fancied me, Dana. Of course, she never admitted it in public, but deep down inside she saw the value of my talents, my gentlemanly manner." "F4, announced Avon, wondering how much more of this he was going to have to take. He made a mental note to have a word with Arak about removing all options that involved Villa. Villa stopped and unfolded the plan. Carell had marked a row of lockers along the wall of the corridor as requiring Villa's special skills, and he set to work on them at once. Avon passed over the implements needed. There was nothing else to do. The lockers contained thermal lances. the cores of which were built from a compound of Herculaneum and radium shielding, obviously helpful in the redesign work the androids were undertaking. Carell's requests were always reasonable. They started the walk back, both laden with lances. Villa continued his reminiscence. Gan, Jenna, Callie, Sulin, they had, it seemed, all respected him and recognized his value. The women had secretly admired him. Only when he recalled that they were now all apparently dead did Villa begin to get morose and wonder if there was some more adrenaline still on the base. Suddenly, Avon stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes on his left wrist. Villa looked back in amazement and rapidly retraced his last few steps. "You know, I have never taken you for a collector of old junk," he announced. "Quiet," said Avon, still looking at his wrist. On it was a teleport bracelet from the ship Avon and Blake had flown together, the Liberator. It was useless since the ship had been destroyed 2 years previously through the recklessness of one of Avon's attempts to find Blake. But it was not as a communicator that the bracelet was attracting Avon's attention. The device also measured radiation, and it was showing a surge at that moment, flashing a dull red where normally it indicated green. Avon told Villa. "Then let's move," the thief replied, already several steps down the corridor. "I've had enough radiation sickness for one lifetime." "It's not that sort of radiation," Avon announced tersely. "It's a much lower wave band. Open that door." He was pointing at a standard corridor opening, a sliding door set into the smooth wall. It was painted with the green and brown of a store's room. Villa had opened a whole series of these already. Most of them contained vacuum attachments and cleaning fluids for the androids. With a touch of the hand plate, and the gentle pressure of a bypass hand probe that Villa kept in his pocket, the door slipped sideways. Inside was the tiny room Villa had expected. It contained a collection of boxes, piles of old junk, remnants of weapons now long since past their use, and decaying spares for laser tubes, and, of course, vacuum attachments. There was hardly enough room to actually get inside. Avon checked his bracelet once more. "In there," he announced. "Start moving it, Villa." Knowing that protest was useless, Villa began to move items from inside the room out to the corridor. As the junk came out, Avon checked it through. It took Villa only 90 seconds to put his foot into a can of cleaning fluid that he knew would be in the room somewhere. Someone had taken a perfectly ordinary store and filled it with rubbish. Villa didn't really want to know why. "Stop!" shouted Avon, and then carefully lowered his voice. "What have you just moved?" Now, actually inside the room, Villa was randomly pushing everything he could find through his legs. Gingerly, he turned round and looked down. There, just behind him, was what could only be described as a black box. Its shiny surface gave no hint of its operation or its intention, but the location of the handles on either side gave Villa a strange notion of having seen it before. "Aurak?" he questioned aloud. He knew it couldn't be, but it looked just like a miniaturized version. No, but built by the same man. But why would Ensor bother with a second version? He already had Aurak. Because Ensor was selling Aurak to the Federation. When we found Ensor, he was dying and badly needing medical help. That help was part of the deal he set up with the Federation, which Servalan intercepted. She was never going to save the old man. Ensor knew that whoever owned Aurak could read all the information passing through computer systems in the galaxy. All the confidential computer traffic. And Ensor also knew that anything he did after that would be readable by Aurak. So, he needed another machine. Another Aurak? No. That would just have led to one machine reading the output of the other without either of them having secrets. There was a sound from the doorway behind them. They spun round as Carell joined in the conversation. She was, of course, smiling and relaxed. Ensor died, Blake got Aurak, and the secret of Ensor's other computer was lost, she said. One to you, Avon. I didn't expect you to find the location. But then I didn't know about the old communicator bracelet on your wrist. And I didn't know about this computer. At least, not at first. But Aurak knew, Carell went on, because Aurak helped Ensor work on the plans of the alternative computer. During the long voyages with Blake and his friends, you must often have felt in need of company, and since the crew were not up to your standard, you conversed with Aurak. Ensor must have removed the ability to recognize what it was that was going to be unreadable to Aurak. After all, if Ensor expected Aurak to be in the hands of the Federation, he didn't want Aurak telling people who had just paid him 1,000,000 credits that Ensor had another machine, even if it wasn't as powerful as Aurak. So, Aurak believed that Ensor had worked on the alternative, but never finished the work. The information would therefore be classified by Aurak as useless. So, here we have a computer which Aurak cannot read, and it cannot read Aurak. Right, Carell agreed. That's why I needed you and Aurak. This machine cannot even talk to the computers on this base to find out where everything is stored. It has just been my way of undertaking statistical research without Aurak knowing. And I hate to disappoint you, but it has nothing whatsoever to do with machine-induced neural deviance. What's his name? Asked Villa, always practical and anxious to escape any conversation about mind, which he knew he would never follow. Caro, Avon told him, and he is it. Does it speak? Of course I can speak, announced Caro. It was a voice identical to Aurak's. I don't think I can take 2 of them, said Villa. You won't have to, Avon told him. Caro has no purpose apart from keeping secrets from Aurak. He looked straight at Carell. There was a deeper meaning to his words that Villa could not grasp. Not quite true, Avon, Carell replied. Aurak has the unfortunate habit of refusing to undertake some tasks it considers too menial. Caro has Ensor's voice just like Aurak, but not his personality. Aurak can pass problems to Cora. It doubles the power. Carell walked across to the machine and removed a key from the top. Avon! This time the voice came from his wrist. Avon touched the bracelet. Yes, Aurak? A Federation ship landed in the docking bay next to this ship 10 minutes ago. Incredible, said Villa. I could have spotted it earlier looking at the sky. So why didn't Aurak tell us? Demanded Avon. He stared hard at Carell. Just one of Caro's little extras, Carell replied, unruffled. Cora can stop Aurak's full functions without Aurak even being aware of it. You thought I'd use Aurak to help me leave the planet once we started putting the new ship together. Carell smiled and said nothing. Villa, meanwhile, was getting worried. He had moved out into the corridor, looking for the inevitable attack. For a moment, he darted back into the small room with a hurried appeal for an adjournment of the debate to the other side of the galaxy. Avon, however, refused to move as he took a hard look at Carell. You must have known they would come. Believe me, my judgment was that we would be away just before interest was aroused. But I did have to make predictions without Aurak. If you want to be convinced that I'm not with the Federation, you can wait here and find out. Or we can try for the ship. As Avon and Carell remained calm, Villa approached panic. In fact, he was almost ready to run to the freighter on his own. Only cowardice kept him back. Avon turned and led the way to the main control room. There, instead of making for the main door, he switched on the viewing screens on the central panels, resting his hands on the back of the controller's chair momentarily, studying the pictures. Outside, 2 figures could be seen leaving a small craft which had landed in the clearing on the far side of the stranded freighters. They were hesitantly making their way to the dome. Servalan, said Avon. As you anticipated. He looked at Carell and glanced down at Caro. Is it still switched off? Carell indicated that the machine was still inoperative as Avon switched on his communicator. Aurak, if we take off in the freighter now, can we outrun the ship that has just landed? He asked. No, came the simple reply. Then we steal theirs, suggested Villa. Not possible, Villa, Aurak told him. The spaceship alongside will only respond to a combination of voice and handprints used in a pre-designated sequence. Villa was hurt. I've broken through those before, he told the computer. But never in less than 4 hours, and I suggest that you will not have 4 hours alone on that ship. All right, Plastic Face, what do you suggest? Surrender. That's brilliant. The best computer in the galaxy, and he tells us to give up. But Aurak was persistent. Servalan is unsure of what is going on here, and she is obviously not here officially. Otherwise, she would bring a full fleet with her, not just one craft. I picked up no computer talk between other ships of her fleet. With her uncertainty, she is likely to keep you on the planet until she works out what has happened and how she can profit by it. I would suggest that in another 2 days, you shall be able to outrun Servalan's ship. You, Avon, and you, Carell, can certainly keep Servalan talking for 2 days. Villa, I suggest you tell her everything at once. Your lies are, at the best of times, implausible, and Servalan may quickly get bored. And with that, Aurak shut down, as the main door of the plantation dome opened to reveal the woman that Avon knew he must one day kill.